Hi, how are you? You all look so beautiful. Okay, so there is this thing that happens in my house when my husband and I watch Netflix. So if you've ever been involved in any kind of theater or film training, you might have heard of something called the suspension of disbelief. The suspension of disbelief is basically this agreement that an audience enters into with a storyteller that says, for this period of time, I'm going to go ahead and suspend my disbelief. I'm going to release my logical mind, and I'm going to play along with the story you're telling me, right? So when I have forced my husband to watch, I don't know, a movie about unicorns or something, inevitably he will roll his eyes and I will say, suspension of disbelief, babe, just remember that, you know. And inevitably when he forces me to watch a zombie movie and I roll my eyes, he says, suspension of disbelief. And that's pretty much how our movie nights go. And it's true that when we suspend our disbelief, we have more fun. It's just more enjoyable when we do that. But here's the thing, something else can happen too when we suspend our disbelief. Miracles happen. Now, the Bible is filled with big, awe-inspiring miracles, but that's not the kind of miracle I'm talking about. I am talking about the tiny little miracles of the heart. The kinds of miracles where something shifts in us and we walk away from a story or a situation changed. Because when we're willing to suspend our logical mind, even for just a minute, we can learn something about the magical world that we've entered into, and we can learn something about ourselves. And very often, even if the story is not literally true, it contains truth. So today, regardless of where you are on the spectrum of belief, I invite you to enter in and suspend your disbelief with me for a hot second and enter into this biblical world where a strange carpenter/rabbi was crucified, rose from the dead, started walking around, making his friends breakfast, and apparently randomly breathing on people. I don't know why. But before we get into the story, I do want to tell you just a few things about myself. The first is, I confess I love a good miracle story, okay? I totally confess that. I love when weird things happen. I don't have time to get into quantum physics with you, so I'm just going to say this. When the disciples were confused and in awe of the kinds of miracles that Jesus did, Jesus said to them, you are going to do even greater things than these. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. I love that idea. I love the idea of miracles, and I love to hope for a miracle. You can call me naive, you can even call me weird. I have been called way worse on social media, so it's cool. I understand that miracles also don't always happen. And I don't have a good answer for why that happens. But I can tell you this, I know that even though it feels often incredibly unjust when miracles don't happen, sometimes the hope, just the hope for the miracle, is the miracle. Just the hope to get to the next day. Sometimes that's the biggest miracle of all. So, along with loving miracles, you should also know that I am mad in love with Jesus, like crazy in love with him. Every time I read my Bible, I fall more in love with him every single time. And here's the thing, you guys, Jesus was really weird. He was just, there's no way around it. He was a weird guy. Even with the whole suspension of disbelief thing, he was still weird. I mean, so there's stories, like there's the time that the people bring him an adulterous woman and want him to judge her, and instead of doing that, he bends over and starts doodling in the sand. I mean, it's just weird when you think about it. It's at best socially awkward, right? It's just weird. There's another story about how the disciples are in a boat and a storm starts coming. Jesus had stayed on the shore and a storm comes and they're freaking out, and Jesus decides, oh, you know what, I think I'm going to go catch up with them. I'm going to go grab a boat and catch up with them. No, he decides to walk across the water. Like, why don't you just get a boat, Jesus? I don't understand. It's just, okay, fine. You're going to do the God thing. But here's the thing. Mark's gospel takes it a step weirder and tells us that when Jesus had walked across the water to the disciples in the boat, he had intended to just keep going. Even though they were freaking out in the boat and they were straining against the oars, it says Jesus was going to keep going. The only reason he didn't was because he realized that they thought he was a ghost. And then he was like, oh no, it's just me, it's cool. Like, this is just weird. weird. It's weird behavior. What's your motivation, Jesus? I don't understand. Okay, the other thing that Jesus did is when he healed people, he spit on them. He spit on them, right? He would bend over, he would pick up the dirt, spit into the dirt, make mud out of it, and slap it on people's eyes. I mean, if you're in the healthcare profession, you're freaking out just at the thought of it. But the thing is that Jesus was a blood and guts kind of God, right? He used his body for his divine work on this earth. He was not a sterile germaphobe. He was not afraid to get his hands dirty and to touch us and to let us touch him. He was a blood and guts, flesh and bone kind of God. He cared just as much about our bodies as he did about our souls. He cared about our fun and our pleasure. He turned water into wine for a wedding. He let the disciples snack on grain on the Sabbath, and he filled hungry bellies with bread and fish, and he allowed his body to become a victim of empire's wrath. He was a blood and guts kind of God. Now, some of the weirdness that I've told you about, it's cultural. I don't have time to unpack the doodling in the mud thing, or the mud on the eyes and the doodling in the sand, but they had meaning. Those things had meaning to the ancient people who were listening to these ancient stories. But the Bible is still clear. Jesus was weird, and the disciples were more often than not confounded by Jesus. They were confused by Jesus. They doubted Jesus. They often had trouble suspending their disbelief. His own family once went to go get him because they thought his behavior was so odd, and they were like, come on, Jesus, you're going to come home with us. And he was like, no, I'm not. And, the scripture shows us time and time again that Jesus was a strange person, and the disciples, even though they loved him, even though they were fascinated by him, more often than not, they had no idea what to do with him, and Jesus would not be handled. That's just the way it was. So last week, we celebrated a pretty weird thing, this whole idea that Jesus, this guy Jesus, rose from the dead. Spoiler alert, even after the resurrection, he was still strange. He apparently walked around wearing disguises because the disciples would talk to him for hours and not realize it was him until the very end. He would show up another day and he was like, I'm going fishing, because the Son of God didn't have anything better to do. World peace, maybe? I don't know. But he just decided he was going to go fishing that day. He walked through doors. He cooked fish for breakfast. He asked people the same question over and over and over again until finally they were like, yes, Jesus, you know this. You know I love you more. Why do you keep asking? And it was because Jesus, as amazing as the resurrection was, Jesus is a guy who is about miracles of the heart and taking care of bodies, small shifts of understanding and aha moments that reveal to us the truth of who he really is. So in our scripture story today, the disciples are hanging out in a locked house. They are terrified. I mean, the body's gone. Mary's talking some gibberish about angels. And, it's dangerous times for these people. It was serious. It was dangerous. They've had some trouble believing Mary. And I have to say, I can't say that I would blame them. I mean, there's a lot of disbelief I would have to suspend to believe that somebody who had been dead for 3 days could come back. I mean, compared to all the muddy healings and the walking on water, this one's a doozy, This is a big one. That something dead could come alive again. And I mean, too many things in this world seem beyond resurrection, right? Hardened hearts, broken political systems, family relationships, bodies that betray us with illness, and brains that don't work the way they're supposed to. Places where it seems like nothing but an absolute miracle is going to suffice, and you just don't see how it's going to happen. So I get how after everything they had been through, the disciples were kind of like, I have had enough. I don't have any more faith to invest in this thing anymore, right? They had been through it. But then, all of a sudden, there's Jesus right there, standing next to them. I imagine those deep brown eyes, so intense. I imagine that smile representing everything restored to them that they thought had been lost with them again. And perhaps the bigger miracle here is not the one that infused Jesus' dead body with life again, maybe the biggest miracle is what happened in the hearts of the disciples when they realized that even after the worst had happened, even after the unimaginable thing had taken place, the thing that you just don't think you're going to get past, after that had happened, we can still experience the presence of God. Maybe that's the real miracle. So, of course, there was our one disciple, poor Thomas. He missed the whole thing. And, just like I'm sure I would be, Thomas was like, I'm done. I got nothing left for you here, I've been there. I have been there. I think I was there last week. I'm here, God. Where were you? Right? I've been believing all this time. You didn't show up. But a week later, Jesus shows up for Thomas because Thomas hadn't been left behind. He hadn't been left out of the blessing of the presence of God. One of the things that makes Scripture so strange is the way it makes the disciples look so bad. That's actually one of the things that makes people say, hey, maybe this is true, because why would we make our leaders look so horrible, right? But they doubt Jesus. They deny Jesus. They leave Jesus. And Jesus still came back for them. In fact, Jesus came back to them. And Jesus was weird that way, right? And he said, go ahead, Thomas, touch me. Go ahead. Put your finger in the hole in my hand. I imagine the awe that must have flowed through Thomas in that moment, that sense of wonder and redemption, of being remembered and known so intimately, even in our doubt, and loved anyway by a God that powerful. I think of the hope that must have sprung up in the heart of that disciple, and I think that that's another miracle, that we can be so known and so loved anyway, even as we stand in the middle of our doubt. And as I wrap up, I have to say that this story got me thinking, it made me wonder, why does hope seem so important to Jesus? Why does Jesus really seem to care about making sure that we're hopeful? And I realized that the opposite of hope is despair. The opposite of hope is despair. And along with despair comes apathy. And apathy makes it really easy to ignore the injustice in the world that Jesus cared so much about. It makes it really easy to not worry about other people's bodies and only worry about other people's sin. It makes it really easy to let empire do what empire will do and let empire crucify who empire will crucify. Apathy makes it really easy to let black and brown bodies get shot down in the street, to let children languish in cages at the border, to let synagogues get shot down. Apathy doesn't care about high suicide rates among LGBTQ communities. Apathy doesn't worry whether trans people can just go to the bathroom in peace. But hope does not let us get away with that, because it gives us responsibility for tomorrow. Hope makes feeding hungry bellies necessary today so that there is strength for tomorrow. Hope makes protesting injustice a requirement today because there is a possibility of change for tomorrow. Hope cares about bodies in the here and now and wants to heal and restore them to wholeness and health. And hope is not for the queasy or the faint of heart. Hope is a blood and guts kind of thing. So Jesus said one last thing in that scripture for today that kind of got me. He said, Thomas, you believed because you saw, but blessed are the people who don't see and believe anyway. And I have to say, you guys, that's us, right? That's you and that's me. We're blessed when we suspend our disbelief because that's weird in this world. It's weird to do that in this world. And so if this story gives me any kind of hope, if it gives me the Jesus kind of hope, this blood and guts kind of hope, the kind of hope that gets me caring about bodies that the empire would love to crucify, then personally I am more than happy to be weird like Jesus. May it be so.